I'd bring him a list of the words I couldn't pronounce. As a result, I may be the only person in the state of Maine who can not only pronounce Nebuchadnezzar, but spell it. One of America's richest men moved to Harlow about 3 years before I started my Sunday job of delivering scripture of my elders to my elders. The turn of the century, in other words, right after he sold his companies and retired, and before his big house was even completely finished. The pool, the elevator, and the paved driveway came later. Mr. Harrigan attended church every week, dressed in his rusty black suit with the sagging seat, wearing one of his unfashionably narrow black ties, and with his thinning gray hair neatly combed. The rest of the week, that hair went every which way, like Einstein's after a busy day of deciphering the cosmos. Back then, he only used one cane, which he leaned on when we rose to sing hymns I suppose I'll remember until the day I die, and that verse of the old rugged cross about water and blood flowing from Jesus' wounded side will always give me chills. Just like the last verse of Stand By Your Man, when Tammy Wynette goes all out. Anyway, Mr. Harrigan's didn't actually sing, which was good because he had kind of a rusty, shrieky voice, but he mouthed along. He and my dad had that in common. One Sunday in the fall of 2004, all the trees in our part of the world burning with color, I read part of 2 Samuel, doing my usual job of imparting to the congregation a message I hardly understood, but knew Reverend Mooney would explain in his sermon. The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the trees of Askelton, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. When I sat down in our pew, Dad patted me on the shoulder and whispered, "You said a mouthful in my ear." I had to cover my mouth to hide a smile. The next evening, as we were finishing up the supper dishes, Dad washing, me drying and putting away, Mr. Harrigan's Ford pulled into the driveway. His cane thumbed up our dooryard steps, and Dad opened the door just before he could knock. Mr. Harrigan declined the living room and sat at the kitchen table just like home folks. He accepted a Sprite when Dad offered, but declined a glass. "I take it from the bottle, the way my pa did," he said. He got right to the point, being a man of business. If my father approved, Mr. Harrigan said he'd like to hire me to read to him 2 or perhaps 3 hours a week. For this, he would pay $5 an hour. He could offer another 3 hours worth of work, he said, if I could tend his garden a bit and do some other chores, such as snow shoveling the steps in winter and dusting what needed dusting year round. 25, maybe even $30 a week, half of it just for reading, which was something I would have done for free. I couldn't believe it. Thoughts of saving up for a motor scooter immediately rose to mind, even though I would not be able to ride one legally for another 7 years. It was too good to be true, and I was afraid my father would say no. But he didn't. "Just don't give him anything controversial," Dad said. "No crazy political stuff and no overboard violence. He reads like a grown-up, but he's just 9 and barely that." Mr. Harrigan gave him this promise, drank some of his Sprite, and smacked his leathery lips. "He reads well, yes, but that's not the main reason I want to hire him. He doesn't drone, even when he doesn't understand. I find that remarkable. Not amazing, but remarkable. He put his bottle down and leaned forward, fixing me with his sharp gaze. I often saw amusement in those eyes, but only seldom did I see warmth, and that night in 2004 wasn't one of them. About your reading yesterday, Greg, do you know what is meant by the daughters of the uncircumcised? Not really, I said. I didn't think so, but you still got the right tone of anger and lamentation in your voice. Do you know what lamentation is, by the way? Crying and stuff? He nodded. But you didn't overdo it. You didn't ham it up. That was good. A reader is a carrier, not a creator. Does Reverend Mooney help you with your pronunciation? Yes, sir, sometimes. Mr. Harrigan drank some more Sprite and rose, leaning on his cane. Tell him it's Ashkelton, not Askelton. I found that unintentionally funny, but I have a very low sense of humor. Shall we have a trial run Wednesday at 3? Are you out of school by then? I got out of Harlow Elementary at 2:30. Yes, sir. 3 would be fine. Shall we say until 4, or is that too late? That works, Dad said. He sounded bemused by the whole thing. We don't eat until 6. I like to watch the local news. Doesn't that play hell with your digestion? Dad laughed. Although I don't really think Mr. Harrigan was joking. Sometimes it does. I'm not a fan of Mr. Bush. He is a bit of a fool, Mr. Harrigan agreed. But at least he's surrounded himself with men who understand business. 3 on Wednesday, Craig, and don't be late. I have no patience with tardiness. Nothing risque either, Dad said. Time enough for that when he's older. Mr. Harrigan also promised this. But I suppose men who understand business also understand that promises are easy to discard, being as how giving them is free. There was certainly nothing risque in Heart of Darkness, which was the first book I read for him. When we finished, Mr. Harrigan asked if I understood it. I don't think he was trying to tutor me. He was just curious. Not a whole lot, I said. But that guy Kurtz was pretty crazy. I got that much. There was nothing risque in the next book, either. Silas Manor was just a borathon in my humble opinion. The third one, however, Lady Chatterley, Lover, and that was certainly an eye-opener. It was 2006 when I was introduced to Constance Chatterley and her Randy Gamekeeper. I was 10. All these years later, I can still remember the verse of the Old Rugged Cross, and just as vividly recall Mellors stroking the lady and murmuring, "Dar's nice." Now, how he treated her is a good thing for boys to learn, and a good thing to remember. Do you understand what you just read? Mr. Harrigan asked me after one particularly steamy passage. Again, just curious. No, I said, but that wasn't strictly true. I understood a lot more of what was going on between Ollie Mellors and Coney Charlie in the woods than I did about what was going on between Marlowe and Kurtz down there in the Belgian Congo. Sex is hard to figure out. Something I learned even before I got to college. But crazy is even harder. Fine, Mr. Harrigan said. But if your father asked what you're reading, I suggest you tell him Dombey and Son, which we're going to read next anyway. My father never did ask about one anyway, and I was relieved when we moved on to Dombey, which was the first adult novel I remembered really liking. I didn't want to lie to my dad. It would have made me feel horrible. although I'm sure Mr. Harrigan would have had no problem with it. Mr. Harrigan liked me to read to him because his eyes tired easily. He probably didn't need me to weed his flowers. Pete Boatsock, who mowed his acre or so of lawn, would have been happy to do that, I think. And Edna Grogan, his housekeeper, would have been happy to dust his large collection of antique snow globes and glass paperweights. But that was my job. He mostly just liked having me around. He never told me that until shortly before he died, but I knew it. I didn't know why, and I'm sure I do know. Once, when we were coming back from dinner at Marshall's in the Rock, my dad said very abruptly, "Does Harrigan ever touch you in a way you don't like?" I was years from even being able to grow a shadow mustache, but I knew what he was asking. We had learned about stranger danger and inappropriate touching in the third grade. For God's sake. Do you mean does he grope me? No, geez, Dad, he's not gay. All right. Don't get all mad about it, Craigster. I had to ask, because you're up there a lot. If he was groping me, he could at least send me $2 scratch tickets, I said. And that made that made Dad laugh. $30 a week was about what I made, and Dad insisted I put at least 20 of it in my college savings account, which I did, although I considered it mega stupid when even being a teenager seems an age away. College might as well be in another lifetime. $10 a week was still a fortune. I spent some of it on burgers and shakes at the Howie's Market lunch counter, most of it on old paperbacks at Daly's used books in Gates Falls. The ones I bought weren't heavy going like the ones I read to Mr. Harrigan. Even Lady Chatterley was heavy when Constance and Mellors weren't steaming the place up. I liked crime novels and western like Shootout at Gila Bend and Hot Lee Trail. Reading to Mr. Harrigan was work. Not sweat labor, but work. A book like One Monday We Killed Them All by John D. MacDonald was pure pleasure. I told myself I owed to save up the money that didn't go into college fund for one of the new Apple phones that went on sale in the summer of 2007. But they were expensive, like $600, and at $10 a week, that would take me over a year. And when you're just 11 going on 12, a year is a very long time. Besides, those old paperbacks with their colorful covers called to me. On Christmas morning of 2007, 3 years after I started working for Mr. Harrigan and 2 years before he died, there was only one package for me under the tree, and my dad told me to save it for last. After he had duly admired the paisley vest, the slippers, and the Briar pipe I'd gotten him, with that out of the way, I tore off the wrappings on my one present and shrieked with delight when I saw he'd gotten me exactly what I'd been lusting for. An iPhone that did so many different things. It made my father's car phone look like an antique. Things have changed since then. Now it's the iPhone my father gave me for Christmas in 2007. That's the antique. Like the Five Family Party line he told me about from back when he was a kid. There's been so many changes, so many advances, and they happened so fast. My Christmas iPhone had just 16 apps, and they came preloaded. One of them was YouTube, because back then Apple and YouTube were friends. That changed. One was called SMS, which was primitive text messaging, no emojis, a word not yet invented unless you made them yourself. There were a weather app that was usually wrong, but you could make phone calls from something small enough to carry in your head pocket. And even better, there was Safari, which linked you to the outside world. When you grew up in a spotlight dirt road town like Harlow, The outside world was a strange,